So we're here to talk a little bit about trauma. And we're here to kind of be a little bit in this space of some trends, what we're seeing in terms of how Israeli society has experienced and responded to this really ongoing situation of trauma that you can decide how far back you want to take it. We're here to look at that, to look at some elements, what it looks like, what it feels like, right? Kind of identify some trends. And we're also here to examine what the consequences of being in this extended state of trauma with these particular features. What does that mean for our ability to think about certain possibilities in the future? What does that mean for our ability to imagine a different kind of society? It was in June that it was during the Iran attack in June, and everything kind of had shut down. But at Hartman, we had been waiting to welcome this group of trauma psychologists who had been planning their trip to Israel for about a year and a half. And for numerous reasons, it didn't work. And eventually, half of them did make it to Israel, and they were stuck in the Imbal Hotel. And we were at home waiting to go into our shelters. And we were sort of deciding, like, okay, should we go out and teach these people? Should we do it over Zoom? What should we do? And we decided we're going to go and we're going to teach them. So part of this class was developed at that moment of having this, by the time we were in the Iran situation in June, it was like, again, it never lets up, right? We'd been in this for a very long time. And it was an opportunity to discuss this with trauma professionals, right? People who had really been thinking about it. I will say also, trauma and its results in terms of the psychological effects are going to be the biggest thing, perhaps, that we're going to be dealing with for many, many, many years. And so I came to these folks, and I was like, and some of them were not Jewish, and they wanted to hear, okay, what is it about Israeli society? How have you been experiencing it? And I think looking at it from the outside and looking at it from the inside are going to be different. I also will say before we begin, this is a space of very much of conversation. You can hear that I'm interested in the observation, and I'm also interested in the critique. And so I want to really be able to have this conversation in a deep and serious way. So I welcome comments, and if you have comments as we go, questions as we go, that's great. All right. So we look at what has happened. I wanted to look at source number one, and I spent some time thinking and looking and reading about what are features, what does trauma cause in individuals and in society. And this book by Elizabeth Bowes, Trauma, the Bible through the lens of trauma, I very much encourage you to kind of, if you can find it, it's a fascinating book. And basically it takes a lot of what we know from a professional perspective in terms of psychology, and applies it to readings of biblical books. So I spent a long time in the beginning, right after October 7th, in the book of Lamentations, right? What does it mean? What is Lamentations trying to do in the face of these personal and collective traumas? So I want to just take out a few of the observations that we have coming out in this book. One of the defining features of trauma is its tendency to cause a sense of isolation, right? Having experienced trauma, and we see this psychoanalytically, and we see this also sometimes on a communal level. When I'm experiencing trauma, I'm in myself. It's hard for me to be able to be in relationship, right? I'm assuming I experienced something that someone else did not, and there's something inherently isolating about that experience. I think that could be true, certainly, that is certainly true for individuals, and it can also definitely be true for a collective, right? A collective who has experienced a high amount of trauma sort of has the sense that our collective is very different than any other collective because we've experienced this and other people have not. At the communal level, at the communal level, we'll skip to the next piece, right? Kai Erikson argues both centripetal and centrifugal forces come into play. Traumatic suffering isolates, as we said, in that it draws the sufferer away from the center of a group, right? If I felt trauma, then I might not feel like I can actually be part of a group. Yet trauma can lead to the formation of different types of community-centered, unshared suffering. Right? So trauma can push us away from other people, but also it can push us towards other people. And that force of away and towards is one of the things that I want to track when we think about the way that Israelis have been dealing with their trauma. We're going to come back also to the rest of it, all right? But I wanted to really kind of focus for a little bit on this notion of loneliness and isolation. We also talk about what trauma can do is that it kind of breaks apart the fabric of society, right? It also can break apart narrative, right? We think about this and we think about, again, Eicha, I think, is a good example. Wait, we had this whole consistent narrative, right, about how God was going to be with us in this land with this temple, and now we had this enormously traumatic experience, and everything we thought about ourselves, the place that we live in, about God, all of that has just fallen apart. Right? So what happens in these traumatic events often is there's a deep sense of loneliness, and there's also an utter unraveling of belief, an unraveling of communal institutions, and we see this in communities that have suffered long trauma. I think one of the great examples is in the book Beloved, right, by Toni Morrison. I think that she perhaps was one of the first ones to really talk about the communal unraveling, the familial unraveling that happens as a result of the trauma of slavery, right? This is when you have individual relationships, kind of people torn apart individually, that also makes it so that the whole communal structure falls apart, right? And that's often what happens in these communal situations. And yet, right, for reasons that we need to understand, that's not, and I do want to use just the words of Kai Erikson, because I think they're very powerful if you look in source number 2, all right? In its form, right, trauma is a form of shock, a gradual realization that the community, right, as it was articulated, as we believed it to be, no longer exists as an effective form of support, right? I thought that we were connected, and now some other force has been traumatic and pushed us apart, and I can't necessarily go to the community anymore. And that an important part of ourself has also disappeared, right? There's a fracturing that happens not only between us and other people, but also between us and ourselves. When I talked before about trying to access a happiness, right, joy in a time when we're experiencing a lot of darkness and trauma, that's also a fracturing of self, right? Is it okay for myself to access that piece of joy when this other part of myself is constantly being traumatized, right? The I, an important part of ourself, I continue to exist, though damaged and maybe even permanently changed, right? But you continue to exist through distant and hard to relate to. But we no longer exist as a connected pair or as linked cells in a larger communal body, okay? So Erikson is also focusing, and I think this speaks to, you look at individuals in Israeli society. All right, I might know I'm trying to get in touch with where I am on this spectrum, and you're trying to create where you are, but how do we even have the ability to connect to each other, all right? And yet, and this is what I began to say, although we suffered on October 7th and consistent traumas, and I'm specifically, intentionally speaking about the experience primarily of Jewish Israelis. That's because I want to observe that piece, right? It is not a lacuna, because we're going to talk about the way that that consciousness has affected Israelis' ability to think about Palestinians, Israelis' ability to see what is happening in Gaza, right? So that's an intentional, right now I'm intentionally focusing on that element of Israeli society, okay? So for reasons that we're going to unpack, Israelis actually have kept going, right? consistently, right? People are getting up in the morning, people are sending their children to school, people are celebrating holidays, right? Sometimes with even more fervor than they did before. So what is it? Why are we not experiencing a kind of unraveling in society? And in fact, we're experiencing the opposite, right? So I want to go through a few different elements that I think are the secret, I would say, of Israeli resistance. Why Israelis are good at picking themselves up and continuing to go. I also want to say in terms of the fracturing, although there is a lot of fracturing within society, it's still holding, right? People have not left. They're still there. They're still there together. So the first element, I think, and this applies, I think, to Jews as well in general, is this penchant for meaning-making. Right? We said one of the features that sometimes happens when we think about trauma is an inability for the stories that we tell to account for our current reality. We told one story and reality looks very different. That's traumatic. We can't move on. Jews are really good at taking those stories from before and applying them to what is happening now, right? We're constantly making meaning. We're constantly connecting, particularly often, this suffering to past suffering, right? This is not traumatic in some sense because this is what it's always been. One articulation for that is obviously, we say in the Pesach Seder, right? We look at this suffering that we're suffering right now, and we say, you know what? That's just always how it is. V'hi she'amda l'avotenu v'lanu, right? Shelo echad bilvad amad aleinu l'chalotenu, ela b'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalotenu. Right? I'm not confused about what's happening. What's happening is exactly what has always happened to the Jewish people. That's what it means to be Jewish. People try to destroy you. Right? So I'm sure many of you have been part of that meaning-making in one way or another. What do you make of that? When we as Jews look at the reality of these traumatic realities and we say, you know what? This is always what it's been. This is what it means to be a Jew. What's happening in that moment? Yeah.
We're compressing time.
Great.
And that compression of time makes the frequencies and the continuity and the continuousness of the trauma ever present.
Right.
But in fact, it's not. But we have times of whether it's assimilation or great joy and growth and spirituality without that trauma. And what we seem to manage to compress it, it's always
Right. I want to say, I think, as a coping mechanism during a hard time, right, I get it to some degree. Oh, it's comforting to me to think that this is not the first time that this has happened. Why? Mostly because I've survived before, and this is a way of saying, okay, I'm going to survive again. And what you're saying is, and this is where I always want to dance, right, toggle between these, but you're saying, but sometimes that kind of statement, which might be meaningful at a moment of darkness, makes it so that I can't actually see that it wasn't always like that, right? And I might not be able to even imagine that it won't be like that again, which has all kinds of consequences, okay? Any other, thoughts about this perpetual meaning-making that we Jews, right? Not only do we mean it, I also say, I gave you the Seder, right? The Seder is a lot about these things that we see now. This is what it has always been. Israelis have this a lot, right? Israelis, not only do we take, there are numerous opportunities in Jewish tradition to connect the trauma of now to past traumas. In Israel, there are also many situations in which, the whole phenomenon of ceremonies, right? We have tkasim. We have all kinds of ceremonies that are associated with national holidays. And immediately, new soldiers that are died have been incorporated into these new ceremonies. So, and our tefillah, our prayers also have this ritual ability to absorb traumatic experiences and make them part of a bigger story and also a part of a ritual action. It happens, and it happens very quickly. And many structures exist in order for us to make that happen. Yeah?
I had teachers from Europe, and one of them said what he said is, at the end, the public brought who's not doing any of his own, except when he does it.
Right. Right. Yes. Right. And sometimes it doesn't. Right. Right. Yes. He said, the end of this piece says, right, every generation, right, in every generation our enemies rise up against us, but God, the Holy One, delivers us from their hands. And what you said was, and his Holocaust survivor teacher said, except when he doesn't. God doesn't always deliver us. Okay. So we have this integration, this penchant for meaning making, which is in some sense a secret of Jewish survival. But it also has its downsides, as we will see. All right. Another thing I think that has made Israelis particularly resilient in the face of all of this, and again, I want to say this is no kind of like justification for any kind of thing. This is an observation. Another is this kind of Zionist mentality that reads a transition from passive existence to active existence. If you remember, after October 7th, everyone started doing things, right? You're cooking and you're baking cakes and you're sending things to soldiers, and very few people let themselves sit down and just experience what was experiencing, because they had to just start acting and start doing things. And I would say that I believe that part of that is also not only this Jewish ethos of, you know what, let's keep going, this is meaningful, this is what Jews do, but also a Zionist idea that what Zionism is about is no longer being passive, about being active. Right? If we look at Einat Wilf's articulation of that in source number 4, Zionism has a story to tell, it's Jews, and it's not only for Jews. Zionism has a story to tell, has power to inspire people. All right, that's not the part that I want to focus on, all right? But Zionism tells a simple story. Victimhood is not destiny. A history of marginalization, humiliation, discrimination, persecution, massacres, even genocide can be transcended. A people, no matter how downtrodden, can find themselves with the power to change their future. And to go to the next piece, right? Zionism was a rebellion against Jewish passivity, right? To the Jewish people, Zionism can carry the message that they need not wait for the Messiah, right? Wilf is articulating something which we can see as true of Zionism in many, many different sources. Rather, they should be their own Messiah. Right? It says there's a famous song that is sung in Israel on Hanukkah, Nes lo kara lanu, pach shemen lo matzanu, that was originally from the Partisans. No miracles happened to us. We didn't find any oil. We're the ones who climbed up the mountain. We're the ones who saved ourselves, right? So a very strong part, right? We're not going to wait for God. It calls upon the Jewish people to be vehicles of their own redemption. And I think that is, whether most Israelis have the words to articulate that, I think it is very ingrained in the way that Israelis act in the world in these situations. I'm not going to sit around. I have to do something. And that doing something is a way of kind of, again, creating communal, taking care of each other, going in without questioning sometimes what we're actually going in to do, right? Because there's a sense that we can't just sit, we have to keep going. Yeah.
You might get to this later, but it's my impression that a number of Israelis have expressed a worry that being traumatized has led to passivity.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Speaking to the resilience of Israel, right?
Absolutely.
People leave the country, right?
Yes.
The Groms.
Yeah.
There's massacring in Gaza.
Yeah.
Killing in Gaza. And so where's
Right.
the active national sovereignty?
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to get there. Okay, I think that's part of what I want to explore. okay, is, all right, yes, in the short term, there are a lot of mechanisms that are explaining, and what are they explaining? All right, I want to just kind of like look at what I'm trying to explain, okay? If you look at source number 9, okay, I think that maybe you could have started with that because I think it expresses this collective that was not fragmented. Actually, let's start with source number 8, okay? Look at source number 8. This is a map that was created by an Israeli artist called Ze'ev Engelmeyer, who has always been very active in the protest movement in Israel. He has a whole costume called Shosh that he goes to the protests. And he also did I almost said caricatures, but because they look like that, but daily pictures of hostages. And he created this map. This map was created in October 2023. And you can see it kind of encapsulates this communal feeling that everybody had, right? If you look, it has the river, I'm looking at source 8, right? The river anxiety, he rewrites the map of Israel according to the river of anxiety, this gulf of crying, the sea of compassion. There's a little bit of compassion here, right? The spring of anguish, hills of suffering, sea of tears, right? Sweat, shortness of breath, heart racing, feeling of choking, inability to function, right? I think that he captures, and you can also remember your own experiences immediately after October 7th. And there's something even in the way that he captures it in a map, right? We're all experiencing this, right? Oh, wait, we're all having this shortness of breath. Oh, you're waking up in the middle of the night, and I'm waking up in the middle of the night. We're all doing it, right? And so I think the framework, though, of the national framework, is one of the things that allows him to create the map. But what you can see is that and this is what I was saying, what I'm trying to explain and account for is also the other side. And you can see that a month later, in November, he rewrote the map, and you can see that now the map is in very bright colors. Right? And in those colors, he puts, right, pools of assistance, Mount Good Heart, right, visiting the injured, hosting evacuees, civil initiatives, hills of compassion, the assistance, there was a lot of people going to do agricultural work, right? So this transition of we're all feeling this trauma to let's all get up and help each other is visually expressed, I think, in these two maps. And so it happens, and it happens rather quickly. But I agree, what I want to continue to ask is, what are the consequences of that short transition, right? What allowed it to happen in the first place, and what are the price of it? Okay? So we said one of the ways that we've already looked a little bit at this ability to immediately assimilate trauma into a much larger, meaningful story. We've talked also about this. We've talked also about Zionism's, jumping up, stepping up, right? Getting together, helping other people, not being the ones. And I will say, my community suffered a lot in this war. I go to Hakel in Baca, and that is Hirsch Goldberg, Poland's, Zichrono Livracha, his community. And I will say just one thing about our community. It was incredible, right? Everybody really stepped up continuously and has just been incredibly involved with many different things that have happened. And a secret about us is also that we always want to be on the giving end, right? It was very hard for members of our community, even those who suffered loss, and we had another soldier who was killed, to be the ones who are accepting help. And we very much want to be the ones who are giving, right? And I think that's a human thing that happens. But again, I think this perspective of don't be passive, be active is very ingrained in a lot of our communities. And it helps us, but there are also questions about what do we do with that inability to really be vulnerable? What are going to be the long-term costs of our inability to really feel vulnerable. And again, I'm saying, I know I'm saying some conflicting things, but I think that they reflect a very complex reality. I think that one of the things also that's interesting to notice about Israeli society that, and I think this is also often true of Jewish society, is obviously that there's a very strong network of connections. I once heard that Israelis were very early adopters of WhatsApp. And part of the reason why it was the group chat feature, which actually reflects a lot of the way that Israeli networks work. That is, right, you have your friends from elementary school and your friends from the army and your friends from your youth group, and you also have your family, and your family is very extended. And right, we have multiple, very many groups that maintain connection with each other. So that means, and again, you all know this because you are very involved in the Jewish community, you know what that feels like. And I think you might remember also what it felt like when people around you couldn't really access that, couldn't understand why it might feel different for you here when you hear what's happening in Israel. The way that you feel that in your body might be different than the way other communities see things that are happening overseas, right? This multiple layers of connectedness. The group is a very big feature in Israeli society. I always notice, one thing I notice as a teacher, I think that for the most part, I understand in the US, in high schools, the classroom generally belongs to the teacher, right? And the students, as individuals in different groups, come to the teacher's classroom. In Israel, the classroom belongs to the students. It's a space that is the students. A class, you remain in your same group of kids from first grade through sixth grade, and then from seventh grade to 12th grade. You never get mixed up. That is, I'm just bringing that to show that this focus on group, right, and groups as a primary place of a mode of association is very strong. These are remnants of a socialist culture as well, right? And so that also, I'm going to feel, because I'm in these groups, this group attachment, it's part of the ethos, and it also has an enormous amount of weight and of depth. And I think that we experience this very strongly, and I would imagine you did too. I think when we look at, I want to read the Yehuda Amichai poem, which I think expresses this idea of when one piece we feel this kind of, one piece gets hurt, and we feel it everywhere. So if you look, I don't know if you're familiar of this poem, but I looked at it a lot, right? Kotel haptzatza. So Amichai wrote this piece in the first Intifada, okay? And I want to it's a poem, so I want to also think about how it feels for you when we read it. It says, Kotel haptzatza haya 30 centimetrim, right? The diameter of the bomb was 30 centimeters. V'kotel tchum pgiata k7 metrim, right? And the diameter of its effective range, I'm in source number 7, was about 7 meters. And I'll continue to read in English, with 4 dead and 11 wounded. And around these, in a larger circle of pain and time, 2 hospitals are scattered and 1 graveyard. But the young woman who was buried in the city she came from, at a distance of more than 100 kilometers, enlarges the circle considerably. And the solitary man mourning her death at the distant shores of a country far across the sea includes the entire world in the circle. And I won't even mention the crying of orphans that reaches up to the throne of God and beyond, making a circle with no end and no God. ולא אדבר כלל על זעקת יתומים, המגיעה עד לכיסא האלוהים, ומשם הלאה ועושה את המעגל, ואין סוף ואין אלוהים. Okay? So another expression of this circles of solidarity and circles of feeling. I want to know how people experience the poem. Any observations, thoughts? how it's making us feel, what questions it raises. Right. It doesn't. Right. And I think that there's something, this doesn't. Yeah. Right? It really captures that sense of the reverberations, right, of what happens. And again, when we're trying to unpack and think about what this trauma causes, we also are reaccessing it for ourselves, right? And we're putting ourselves back into that situation. And I wonder, right, I think that was something I remember it being sometimes difficult. Another thing that was difficult sometimes to explain is when we were going through a period of time when we had a lot of soldiers being killed, right? And what it means to wake up every morning, oh, okay, now we can, the publication of the new names, right? What that felt like. And everyone, in the words of Sefer Shemot, en bait asher en sham met, right? There's very little, there's almost no houses where there isn't some kind of connection, right? And as we've said, that is where people were at, right? And in some sense, that is where they continue to be. It's a very difficult reality to talk or imagine your way out of. So there's physical threats, and some physical threats are closer and some are further away, right? But holding in your body that enormous sense of loss, that constant sense, right? That sense of people, being under threat and loss is something that is really pervasive. And as we've said, the connections, the solidarity, make it so that we can keep going on, but it's in us. It's deep, and it's there, and it's difficult to be able to imagine ourselves out of it, right? So what I want to start to argue, right, is that we as Jews and as Israelis I can explain to you why my kids right now are somewhat okay. Right? I can explain because things have been assimilated into a story. And I can explain because someone said to them, you got to keep going to school, right? This is what you do. Because maybe your suffering is not as bad because someone else is suffering more. We've done all that. We have the mechanisms to be able to do that, all right? But what are the costs of those modes of resilience? And that's what I want to do for the second half of this talk, is think about how these different modes of resilience, which have to a certain degree taken us through, right? What have they also made us unable to do? All right? Before I switch to that part, I wanted to hear any kind of questions or comments that we have about the mechanisms themselves, right? How it has worked, what we're feeling in terms of the trauma, and also how it has been translated and how it has been assimilated into the narrative and into the ritual and all of that, and why, to some degree, right, Jewish Israelis are a little bit okay, right? Any questions, comments so far? Yeah. Right. I think it's interesting. I'll just say, I want to speak to that. I think that sometimes, right, as a result of in Jewish history, we would say, why did this horrible thing happen to us? It was our right? We deserved it, right? God and a lot of, Deuteronomy warned us about this, and Eicha is saying, even Eicha, I think, is questioning that dynamic, right? Is it our fault? But also we're mad at God because God did it. I think what's interesting that we don't hear that so much right now, right? Oy, right? Oh no, maybe we've been sinning. Maybe we've been doing bad things. Maybe that's why these things have befallen us. We don't hear a lot of that happening in Israel right now. And I think that that's worth asking that question, right? What is it? Why is that has been a response in certain situations historically, and that's not quite the response that we hear happening now. So what's that about? Yeah.
Right, but also, isn't it kind of
Right.
right, in 2023, and they were still angry
Right.
50 years later at the government.
Right.
They felt totally abandoned by the society.
Right.
So even before we get to those who sort of blame Israel in total for what's happened in Gaza, I do think there is within Israeli society an internal critique, but it's not like a self-critique, it's a critique of the government as representative of the people.
Right, definitely. Right? I think I was sort of thinking a little bit about the theological critique, right? Theology right now is not being used quite in that way, right? Theology is being used in a different way, and we could talk about that, right? Well, God is really on our side, right? The October 7th is not interpreted by most religious people in Israel as saying, oh, God has abandoned us. No, we know that something bad happened, but God really is on our side, and we're going to go and we're going to, continue to have this war because we believe that God is on our side. So that was the part that I think I was saying we haven't really heard that voice. But you're right. This idea that we do kind of have to look internally did happen eventually, right? Some of what I'm describing are things that we felt, for a few months after October 7th, right? Where I'm just kind of trying to triage and take care of everyone, right? And there wasn't as much an ability to kind of look and say, wait, how did this happen to us? Right now in Israel, there is a big conversation about what happened? How did this happen? Right? There's a critique of the government. There's on both different sides of the political spectrum are, of course, as you said, they're not necessarily taking responsibility themselves. They're blaming each other, right? Oh, well, you didn't do this or you didn't do that. But there is a lot of, wait, this isn't only about the enemy who did this to us. There was something about our society, about our government, about our policies that maybe allowed some of this to happen. So that, I think, is definitely part of the discourse. Okay? Yeah.
It's really back to what you said about the Zionism narrative.
Yeah.
Something bad happened because God is punishing us doesn't fit.
Exactly. Right. And I think that sort of explains a little bit of it, right? A little bit of what we're seeing. What you're saying is when we think back about this being part of the resilience and part of the kind of public face of this has to do with a Zionist narrative of, being passive and not being active and not passive. There's also a theological aspect to that, right? It's not, things don't happen because of God. They happen, right, because we did something. And it doesn't fit necessarily into a secular Zionist framework, okay? Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Yeah. Right. 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 Exactly. Yes. Right, right. I think what I would, yes. I think, what's your name? Mati? What Mati is saying is that we haven't yet addressed a portion of Israeli society which doesn't feel traumatized, which sees these events as miraculous, which then says it's a miracle and it's amazing that we can now go into Gaza and create a Riviera. That's terrific. That's amazing. And then she said, and the resistance is not that we see, and the response is not only to the government, but it's also to that voice within Israeli society that sees this as not traumatic at all, right? As actually an opportunity, a miraculous opportunity. I think what I also want to respond to that, I guess part of my question, or the question that I'm trying to think about here, along the lines of what you're saying, is, let's say there's some portion of the population that feels like this is miraculous and amazing. How is that normalized, right? Why do we have more people who are going along with that than those who might have these very clear messianic beliefs, right? You're identifying a particular part of a messianic religious Zionism that also has a lot of political power right now, and they're very vocal, and they're talking about this as the messianic era, and destroying Gaza is part of that. Why is that, why are other people going along with it? Right? If it is a kind of radical, why are there secular people who are kind of in some ways complacent with that? I think that is part of what I'm trying to kind of think about. And I think that part of that has to do with what I'm saying about trauma, right? Trauma can also, in Jewish history, is a justification for certain kinds of use of power. And if someone else is putting some kind of messianic framework on it, okay, fine, right? Because I do feel that there's a moral justification. There's something that's happening within my trauma that allows me a way of using force, right? That is, trauma allows me to use force. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to unpack it a little bit when we look at an essay at the end by David Hartman, right? How does trauma, allow us to do certain things, to act in certain ways politically? So I think it's very important to point out that not everyone is wanting to be vulnerable. I think that was a little bit what I was alluding to when I said Israelis have, there's this weird paradox when it comes to vulnerability, right? On the one hand, we're super vulnerable and we're very traumatized, and on the other hand, it's really uncomfortable, right? And we don't want to be there for a very long time, and we want to be taking care of people, and we want to go in and defend ourselves, right? It's an odd paradox. So you're pointing to the side of the paradox that says, oh no, we're not, trauma? No, we're going to keep on going, right? It's also that part that we're seeing now of the government saying in the past week, I don't know if you've been following, right? Our government has said that we are no longer allowed to call what happened on October 7th a massacre. It's not a massacre. We're not supposed to call it a massacre for exactly the reasons that Mati was outlining and more, right? How do I stop any kind of looking inward and seeing what internal forces might have caused this? Well, if it didn't really happen, or it wasn't as bad as you've made it out to be, then I don't have to do any kind of reflection. I think for Americans to hear that piece of information is mind-blowing, because what does that give to all of the people here who have, remember, right after October 7th, people said, oh, that wasn't a massacre, right? There's elements in our government who are delivering that to the forces outside of it. Oh, no, there was no massacre, right? There's this desire to not, right? Because sometimes when I acknowledge something as problematic and I acknowledge it as really bad, that can make it so that I have to do some kind of evaluation as to why it happened. So now we've been told, no, you can't call it a massacre. There's also a lot of, not a debate, right? The government is also calling this war. It divides along political lines. Somehow we all went along with this iron swords thing, not really sure how that happened. Some people have just said it's going to be called the October 7th War, something like that, or the Shmini Atzeret War, the Simchat Torah War. And the government has said we're going to call it Milchemet HaTkuma, right? The war of revival, the war of rebirth, okay? Again, taking that map and taking this solidarity and using it in a very political kind of way. Okay, so that I can't see Mati, but right, so Mati's comments took us in all of those directions. Yeah.
What are they calling it if not a massacre? Is there another
Iroei HaShiva beOctober, right, the events of October 7th.
just sort of
Neutralizing the level of trauma in order to kind of not acknowledge their own responsibility in it. So I do think that when we think about, as you can hear, we've already gone to some of the downsides of some of this. And I wanted to, as we enter into this piece of the talk, I wanted to start with this poem, which was read to me by a friend of mine named Avi Dabush, who, if you haven't followed any of his work, I think that you should. He is the current head of Rabbis for Human Rights in Israel. He's been doing social justice work in the South for many, many years. He was on Kibbutz Nirim on October 7th. He was locked in his safe room for the entire time. There were terrorists all around his kibbutz. And he has been he read this poem to a group of us a few days after. And I'll explain a little bit about his activism after we read the poem, because I think it's an interesting transition. This is a poem by Tali Versana Eisman. She didn't write it in this context, but he put it in this context. כשאני טובעת, אין לי צורך שתתארו לי את המים, לא צבעם ולא עומקם, הרי אני חשה אותם עד צווארי. יש לי רק בקשה אחת, אל תחדלו לרגע מלתאר לי איך נראית היבשה. When I'm drowning, I don't need you to describe the water to me, not its color and not its depth. I feel it up to my neck. I have only one request. Do not for one moment stop from describing to me how the land looks. Right? So what Avi was saying to us a few days, really soon after, was, yes, we're in this hotel in the Dead Sea. We have suffered an enormous amount of trauma. But you who are one step outside, you have a few different options. You can be with us, and we want your support, but it's almost as if to say you could drown with us, right? Or I need something different. What I need from you is something different. I need you to be able to remember what the land looks like. I can't right now. I can't envision what the land is. It's hard for me. I feel the trauma everywhere. I feel the pain everywhere. But I need from you who are not as traumatized, to remember what the land looks like. Any responses, thoughts about that poem or that position? Because I think it's also an interesting position as American Jews, right? Looking at certain traumas that Israelis are. It also could be read as that kind of call. How much do I want you to also feel it with me, the empathy? And sometimes I do. And how much do I want you to be holding some other kind of vision, right? To remember that it's possible that we might exist beyond all of this. Yeah, did you want to say something?
We did the Hartman series, liberal Zionist.
Yeah.
And one of the meetings, it was about responsibility for Jews to rebuke
Right.
Another Jew when their situation requires it, and how to do so. And I think this poem speaks to the notion of telling the story of what Judaism is and means in a situation when some of us are struggling to
Right.
understand how to deal with
Right.
calamity.
Right. And it's a really powerful way of, like, on some ways, really acknowledging that the drowning is real. And I also want someone to be able to hold the future. And I think that that's an enormous challenge that we're still in. Because of all of the things that we've described about having felt it for so long, it's very hard to be in the position of the one who can see the land. It's really hard to imagine what that even looks like, right? Because we've been in this protracted sense of pain and trauma for so long. Yeah.
The poem is not just asking for someone to hold the vision. They're saying to describe it to me,
Yeah.
which I think is not a universal reaction. I think a lot of people who are drowning do not want that description to be shared with them.
Right. So what do you make of that?
That is one reaction of several.
Right, yeah. And that was why I think it was important for me to bring it in the voice of Avi, right, Dabush, who was not the only voice that I heard in those weeks in the South after October 7th, right? I heard one of the people in Kibbutz Be'eri, and I'm sure you've heard some of these people, who said, I was the one who was creating all these dialogues with Palestinians, and I was the one who was driving Palestinians to hospitals, and now it's done. I'm done. I'm not doing it anymore. I heard that voice also, right? That was part of it. What do I learn? I learned that I cannot trust anyone, that I am going to be in this defensive mode, and I can't imagine anything else. So that was one voice. And I also curated Avi's voice, which said, I'm going to be in it, but I want you to keep that sort of flame alive. And I will say that he has been a big advocate for that all along. He's also been an advocate as the war progressed for Palestinians and saying, okay, I'm going to be the one who's going to keep saying this is not okay, what's going on. We need to be able to imagine. He ends all of his posts with ani ma'amin, right? I actually believe that there's a way for people to be able to live together. I refuse to stop saying that. I'm going to keep saying it. What is my yabasha? My yabasha is that eventually we're going to get out of this, that eventually different parts of our population are going to be able to live together. But many Israelis are suffering from an inability to articulate what that looks like. And I think an expression of that inability, and this is a little bit traumatic itself, I think, is a deep numbness that happens when we are traumatized, right? If we went back to those initial kind of psychoanalytic things, when I suffer from enormous amount of trauma, it could help me be empathetic to other people who are suffering. And if it's really acute and ongoing, it can actually make me completely unable to. And that's, I would say, a somewhat legitimate psychological response. I don't have the capacity. I was in a group at Hartman where we were unpacking some of all of these things. And one of the Palestinian Israelis that we have at Hartman had said something about how, let's look and acknowledge what's happening here. And I think she wasn't the only one. There were a bunch of people in the room. It was, I think, in March 2024, right? And it was actually, now I'm remembering, it was right after Israel had actually, killed a bunch of people who were waiting in line for food. And there was this kind of a momentary taking of responsibility for that certain Israelis had. And the Hartman Institute actually put out a statement that said this is unacceptable. And some of the people in the room had said, so some of the people in the room said, I can't, it's not okay. I can't take responsibility for this. When we put out this statement, actually, a lot of Americans were happy that the Institute had put out the statement and said, you know what, certain things that have happened in this war, it's not necessarily our fault. We didn't cause this war, but as military powers, we have a certain amount of responsibility. There was a lot of support by our American constituents. And there were many parents from our schools in Israel who wanted to leave the school because we had made that statement, because Danielle Hartman had made that statement. What do you mean? And my daughter came home from school. She said, I heard Danielle Hartman said something against the soldiers. That was what had kind of trickled down to her, in her experience. Right? So even that ability to can I take responsibility? Can I feel empathy? Right? There's a big divide. And in that context, one of the Israelis, the Jewish Israelis, said, I can't. You know what? I'm not at that point. I have lost too much. I'm continuing to lose too much. My children are in Gaza. I can't care. I don't have the capacity. Yeah. Wait, I just want to finish the response. And, right, my Palestinian Israeli colleague said, yeah, and you know what? At a certain point, when the numbers of the death toll in Gaza have my siblings and my family has gotten so big, I don't have the capacity to listen to you continue to talk about October 7th anymore. I don't have it. I can't. I don't want to listen. Right? So in that room, Baruch Hashem, they actually were listening to each other. But that numbness, right, an inability to feel empathy in the face of trauma is something that we hear very strongly in these different communities. Yeah, what do you want to say?
Can you please address the Israeli media's responsibility for not allowing the Israelis to even understand anything about the Palestinian or the Iranian suffering?
Right. Yeah, well, all I can say is yes. right? I think that I'm looking at some of the sort of emotional things that are holding people back from being able to see it, but you're right. What are we responding to? We're responding to a lot of Israelis I think at this point it's different, right? You can't deny it. But for many months, right, it wasn't being reported on in Israeli and in Hebrew media, right? The degree to which destruction was happening. And the media was definitely part of what was happening. Right? So this is not only psychological and emotional and empathetic, there's also an element of who controls information and how does that information happen. I think that a poem that expresses this empathy, this inability to feel empathy, is this following poem. As I said, it's tough, it's hard, all right? This is Yael Statman, and she calls it to a friend who looks at starving children in Gaza and feels nothing, okay? Who's she writing to? Is it her friend? Is it herself? We'll see. And she feels no compassion. ולא מרגישה חמלה, ולא מרגישה רחמים, ולא מרגישה אחריות, ולא מרגישה אשמה. She feels no compassion, and she feels no mercy. She feels no responsibility, and she feels no guilt. And she feels no anger, and she feels no sorrow. And she feels no curiosity, and she feels no despair. And she feels no horror, and she feels no joy. And she feels no victory, and she feels no awakening. And she does not feel that this could have been her tiny baby, hungry, bleeding, dead. And she feels no lack, and she feels no cold. And she does not think of the other side, and she does not concern herself with the other side. And she is neither proud of it, nor denies it. And she doesn't love that this is how it is, but this is how it is. ולא אוהבת שככה זה, אבל ככה זה. That ככה זה, this is how it is. How are people? Any responses, thoughts? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. He said he experienced this with a friend whose niece was in Gaza, was a hostage. And he said he tried to initiate a conversation about water supply not getting into Gaza. And the friend said, how can you talk to me about water? My niece is in the tunnel. So what I tried, as you can hear, right, I think this is, it's real, right? This is part of what is experienced, I think, even till today. What I've been trying to do, though, along as we've had this whole class, is at least to hear this with a little bit of empathy, right? That is to say, how do we get to this point? Because I think sometimes on the outside, right, it looks like, how could you possibly think this? This is totally ridiculous, right? Do you not see? Let's say you do have the information. How can you not see? How can you not feel? How can you not do things differently? It's deep, right? The trauma is deep, and it causes a lot of blindness. And I think that we also sometimes as outsiders at least need to be real about that and to need to be empathetic. And empathy is different than justification. Those are different things. But just understand sometimes where the gaps are, right? An inability, a society that has been inundated with this trauma is unable to see or feel another. That's horrible. It's not a good situation, and it doesn't bode well for the future. It's not hopeful, but it's real. And I think that we can see that, and unfortunately, on both sides of the border, we can see in different populations, I've suffered too much. I can't be bothered with your suffering. And that's one of the biggest barriers that we're facing. Those of us who want to be able to imagine a new future need to contend with this feeling, right? Even though I would want to say, yes, at a certain point you're going to have to make different choices and you're going to have to think about it differently, right? But that feeling exists. I think there's also a lot of justification. I have a lot of friends and students. I taught for several years at a gap year program, Israeli students and American students. Right? If kids are going to go in and have to fight for the country soon, or if you have kids in Gaza, it's hard for you to do the cheshbon nefesh, right? Hard for you to even ask any of the questions because it's got to be okay, right? How can it not be okay? And I just think that it's important to just sort of feel that a little bit in order to then be able to think, how can we maybe work together to imagine something different? But the pain is real. I think one of the places where I have these moments of hope is, if you know, there's often, so when I talked about the tkassim, right, the ceremonies that we have, say around Yom HaZikaron, which can be helpful in Israeli civic culture because now, new funerals, and there's a funeral, like ways that you do funerals, and everything's kind of integrated into this narrative and into these rituals. And obviously, many Palestinian Israelis feel very much outside of that culture. Great, you have found a way of assimilating your own loss, but what about our loss? That's absent from the public square. And one of the places where I see a lot of hope is that Combatants for Peace, which is an organization that is people who have lost, on both sides of this conflict, who have lost people for 20 years. They've been doing a joint Yom HaZikaron memorial service. And that's this sort of flash of what it might look like to say, I've lost and you've lost and my loss is going to help me see your loss rather than make me unable to. But that's a leap and that's a jump, right? And that's something that I have to be able to not be drowning enough to be able to actually think about that. What do you want to say? Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a she. She's talking to you. She's saying you.
Yeah.
You're feeling this. You're not feeling this. You're not feeling that. And that's the way it is.
Right.
And that's why it's so powerful. It's a confrontational phone.
Yes, I think that's right.
It's a letter pass or it's a letter back to the friend.
Yes.
This is what you're.
Right. Right. So again, who are the people who can hold up the mirror, right, and say, wait, do you realize what's going on here? And when am I in a position to hold up the mirror? And when am I not in a position to hold it up the mirror? And how can I be empathetic of the one who is and the one who isn't? Right? I think there is another way to read the poem, which is a little bit, could be Statman's feelings about her own mixed feelings about what happens. Right? I think if we're real about this, many Israelis have mixed feelings, right? At some point, it is hard for me at this exact moment because I just lost all these people in my community and I can't. But I should, but I know I should, right? This voice that says, it's just, that's how it is. I wish it could be different, but it's not, right? I think that there's also, it can be a confrontational poem that within Israel, we hear this voice that says, this is what you think and it's not okay. And also, what is it about myself that feels this and doesn't feel it and how do I deal with that? Yeah.
Just exactly. I think it's also important to note that joint memorial that happens on Yom Kippur, Saints October
Right. Yeah.
It just, even then, had to be under heavy security, but it's just been impossible.
Right.
That they haven't been able to do that. And it really does raise the question of whether Israelis are so immersed in their own suffering and in Jewish suffering in general, with, the Holocaust Memorial Day, and a week later, the Israeli Memorial Day, and so forth, and all the memorials and all the ceremonies, if that has become an obstacle.
Right.
To identify the suffering of yourself.
Right, right. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it happened, but many Palestinians who were accustomed to coming were not able to come because they weren't allowed to come into Israel. So I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I think it happened in some sense, but you're very right that it didn't happen in the way that it had happened in the past because they couldn't come. Right. Right. Yeah. Did you want to say?
No, I was just going to say, can you repeat what he said for those who can't?
Oh, sorry.
The other option, folks, is you can raise your hand, and Susanna has a microphone.
Oh, that's an option. And then I don't have to say it.
You can say what you're going to say or ask your question into the
Right. The point that was made, which is important, was that in this lovely Command for Peace ceremony, it actually was not able to happen in the way that it had happened before, since October 7th, because the people who were the Palestinians are not allowed to come into Israel, and so it was took place on the West Bank and was broadcast within Israel. And then that brings the question as to whether it's even possible for Israelis to be able to have these spaces, right? If the spaces have been marginalized to that degree. That was the comment. Yeah.
In the first part, you helped us understand the infrastructure the Jewish religion and people have for resilience and for moving forward. It's all happened before. We know how to deal with this. I wonder if you'd speak to what the Torah says, what the rabbis have said about empathy for non-Jews. Right. Do we have much experience in that arena, which we're sort of being tested on now?
Right. I do. I think that, right, we do have those sources, and we have a lot of sources that say that, have negative things to say about non-Jews. And I think that we need to be realistic about some of the sources that we have. And I think that we need to be realistic about the way that some of those sources are being used, right? Even in a democratic society, I can marginalize certain elements by using certain Jewish texts. And at the same time, and this is where I think the covenantal aspect of the way that David Hartman deals with this, I think speaks to some of what you're saying. I do think we need to look to Jewish texts to see how we get ourselves out of it. And if you look at source number 13 and 14, this is one among different pathways, right? One of the kind of, I would say, bumper sticker phrases that you heard that encapsulate what I said in the El Statman poem is, Aniye Ilcha Kodmim. Okay, there's this law in rabbinic when we're thinking about dividing a division of resources, right? It says, and it reads the verse in Sefer Shemot that says, "K'im kesef tilve et ami." All right, you should lend money as an expression of taking care of other people, of tzedakah in some sense, right? You should lend money to my people. So the Midrash Halacha in the Mechilta that you have says, right, what does that mean, my people, right? How do we decide how we prioritize the allocation of resources? My people, that is to say, if an Israelite and a non-Israelite are standing in front of you for a loan, my people take precedence. And then it goes on to create other, if it's a poor person and a rich person, the poor person takes precedent. That I think we can get on board with, right? Okay. If it is a poor person of your city versus a poor person of another city, the poor person of your city takes precedent, okay? So that the poor person of your city takes precedence, Ainiyei Ercha Kodmim, is something that you heard a lot in Israeli public discourse of how do I prioritize what are the things that I'm willing to work for and sacrifice and give to. I'm going to worry about my people first, right? And that's a legitimate, as we've said, there are many reasons to do that. And at the same time, right, I think that's not the only way that we can imagine. It could be that in order to structure societies, we need to have communities, and we also need to have states, and we need to have borders, and we need to know who it is that we're actually worrying about. But we also need to be able to think about who's left out of that story. And I think one way of articulating that is to read that text and then read the next text, which is source number 14. Ir sheyesh ba Yisrael ve'ovdei kochavim, right? A city that has both Jews and non-Jews. Those who haparnasim hagovin Yisrael u'me'ovdei kochavim mipnei darkei shalom. Those who oversee the communal fund should collect both from Jews and from non-Jews for the sake of peace. So they should distribute to poor non-Jews and poor Jews for the sake of peace. And one should eulogize and bury the deceased non-Jews for the sake of peace, and one should comfort the mourning Gentiles for the sake of peace, okay? Now this piece, we could spend a whole class unpacking what exactly is going on here, right? One read is, you don't really have this obligation to do these things for non-Jews, but it's a good idea to do it. Right? If you want to create a stable society, that's what you should be doing. But I think you can read it more as a moral call, right? You know what? I know that there are pieces of our Torah that differentiate between different kinds of people. But I want to go more in the Tselem Elohim model, right? In the let's have a needs-based way of allocating resource. Let's look at who needs this, who needs comfort, who needs resources. Let's look at that. If I want to have a shalom society, I need to be able to stop saying Aniye Erecha Kodmim at a certain point. I can acknowledge that impulse, and I also need to be able to call and to say, you know what, now is a time for Darkei Shalom. I acknowledge difference between us, and I think that that's also unrealistic. I think sometimes in the discourse around, if you want to say Israel and Palestine, if you want to say different groups within Israel, however you want to articulate it, there's a sort of fantasy that we're going to be able to not acknowledge difference between us. We're going to come to some one-state solution that acknowledges no difference and no historical trauma, and we're just going to all live together. I think that this text, again, could be a model because it says, yes, there are differences in society. That is true and that is real. There are different levels of need and different levels of society, of vulnerability. But as people who are taking responsibility, to go back to that Zionist move of taking responsibility, as people who are taking responsibility for what is going to happen next, we have the ability to choose. To say, now I'm going to look at this differently. Now I'm going to take Darkei Shalom as the guiding principle. Now I'm going to say, I would like there to be equality. I'm going to move towards that. And to that, I would say, and this is where the piece from David Hartman, how many people have looked at this before? David Hartman on Auschwitz or Sinai? Some? Yes? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, that's helpful for me to know. Good job, rabbis. Yay, okay. Hartman rabbis. All right, so David Hartman writes this piece. It's after the Sabra and Shatila massacre in Lebanon, okay? So what has happened is, and it's one of the first times really in Israeli public discourse that they start to ask questions about indirect responsibility for suffering for Palestinians. Right, so he published this basically, in the refugee camp, the Palestinians were massacred by the Christian Phalanges, but the Israelis stood outside the camp, and they allowed it to happen. And there was what is called the Khan Commission report in the Knesset that said, it used the Eglah Rufa, the beheaded calf metaphor, to say, you know what, Yadeinu lo shafchu et dam, that we didn't do this, but we have indirect responsibility, and we need to say that, and we need to make changes in our society that are going to acknowledge our responsibility. So it was really one of the first times that Israel started to kind of think about what the effects of use of power and military force are. And so he writes this book, this essay called Auschwitz or Sinai, and he says, one of the fundamental issues facing the new spirit of maturity in Israel is, should Auschwitz or Sinai be the orienting category shaping our understanding of the rebirth of the state of Israel? There are important differences resulting from the relative emphasis we place on both of these two models. Okay, so just when he's calling Auschwitz one of the models, right, that connects a little bit to what we've been saying about Omdim aleinu l'chalotenu, trauma, right? He's basically saying, is Jewish trauma going to be the orienting principle as we go forward? Or should there be a different model, which is the Sinai model, which is harder to imagine, but you could start to imagine what it might be. In the 20th century, we've again become a traumatized nation, right? And he's talking post-Holocaust, right? The ugly demonic forces of anti-Semitism has horrified our sensibilities. We can never forget the destruction, right, that we've just, right, felt. And many, therefore, justify and interpret the significance of our rebirth in terms of Jewish suffering and persecution, right? And I think that this is true historically. And we can also see how all of that plays into a lot of the conversation that we've been happening. But he says, right, and he says it's all over the place, as you can see, right? Never again will we be vulnerable, to go back to Mati's, right? Never again will we expose our lives to the political forces. We're going to be strong. And he says, while I respect and share the anguish expressed in these sentiments, I believe it is destructive to make the Holocaust the dominant organizing category of modern Jewish history and of our national renewal and rebirth. It is both politically and morally dangerous for our nation to perceive itself essentially as a suffering remnant of the Holocaust. Right? He says, once I prioritize the trauma, Hartman is saying that's a huge mistake. Right? I acknowledge it's enormous. And for him as a person, the Holocaust was very present in the way that he felt and thought and taught about things. And he goes, it's a harsh, very harsh critique. He says, right, there are individuals obsessed, right? It is childish and often vulgar to attempt to demonstrate how the Jewish people's suffering is unique in history. He had a very almost vulgar way of speaking himself, right? He would bang on the table and he was so convinced of the problematics of this model that he actually didn't want the high schools to go to Poland. He's like, I don't want you to take them there. I think it's really highly problematic. Why? Because of what he articulates in the next one, right? What happens when we dig into this trauma? We say, no one can judge the Jewish people. No nation has the right to call us to moral judgment. We need not take the moral criticism of the world seriously because of the uniqueness of our suffering places us above the moral judgment in an immoral world. And he uses elsewhere in the essay the phrase, a moral blank check. Right? He says when we focus on this story, and remember, I agree, I think that in some ways this story is what held us through. As I said, Omdim aleinu l'chalotenu has given us comfort and solidarity and resilience. And I still believe that Hartman's call is one that we need to think about and we need to heal, to examine. Right? When is the trauma a way of justifying certain kinds of use of Jewish power? It happens almost inherently. And so what Hartman says is, I don't want to talk about Auschwitz. Now, I think it's unrealistic, right? I think that the degree to which anti-Semitism has been reawakened, the degree to which there was a massacre on October 7th, right, makes it so that we can't be as extreme as he is in saying, let's not talk about Jewish suffering. We need to talk about it. But is it the model or not? And he says, the model that I want is not that. What I want is the model of Sinai. What does Sinai do? Sinai is the model of Sinai awakens the Jewish people to the awesome responsibility of becoming a holy people. At Sinai, we discover the absolute demands of God. We discover who we are by what we do. Not what's happened to us. Again, to play and to acknowledge that passive versus active. What Hartman is saying is, how do I go from passive to active? I don't want to be passive. Suffering or dwelling on my suffering actually makes me passive. What I want to do is take responsibility, moral responsibility. Right? We discover, Sinai calls us to action, to moral awakening, to living constantly with the challenges of building a moral and just society which mirrors the kingdom of God in history. Sinai creates humility, right? What am I doing? I'm checking myself. I'm seeing it, right? An openness to the demands of self-transcendence, right? And so much of what we faced in Auschwitz and what we face now has allowed us to not live up to those demands, Hartman would say. And I do believe, I don't know for a fact, but I do believe that this essay has been reawakened also for me, because what it does, and for many of us, is it acknowledges the centrality of trauma to our story, and it calls us to continuously ask the question of how are we using that trauma, and is there a bigger calling, a larger calling beyond the trauma that is asking us to do something else, that is asking us not only to continue to dream, but to put systems in place that are going to actually make some kind of difference possible. And so I'm giving you can read it on the rest of Hartman on your own. But I think that we've seen, right, the deepness of the ability to be resilient, the way that resilience, when I tell my story, also the other thing I didn't say is obviously, if Israelis are good at telling their own story, they're also good at excluding people from their story, right? If this is our Veisha Amda and it's our story and it's the Jewish people, what does that mean about all the other people who live with us, right? There's something, a contradiction. Sometimes when I tell my story, it actually excludes the other specifically, right? When I worry about the person next to me, I by definition, forget about the person outside. But are there ways that we can use some of these sources to reconnect, to acknowledge the trauma, but then allow it to be this place of empathy for the suffering of others, as opposed to an inability to feel it? So those are some of my thoughts on it, and I do think we have a few more minutes, so I would like to open it up for comments and questions and pushing back and whatever it is that you want to do. Yeah?
Okay, what do you think of the Super Bowl ad?
The anti-Semitism one? I think that's not what we should be focusing on, right? I think that he would say, I think we have other things to do in terms of rebuilding Jewish identity. I will say it that way, right? I think when we're talking about Israel, a lot of what I believe or what I'm thinking about is how do we create political realities that might actually make it so that different people in this land can live in peace. It's far off, it's hard, it's difficult, it's not impossible, but it's really hard. So that's what I'm thinking about in terms of Israel. Again, all the caveats aside, right? But what I'm thinking of in terms of America, I think, yes, is anti-Semitism real? Yes, it's real. But what I want to deal with is a surge of people who are interested in being involved in Jewish life, right? I work a lot with college students. We have a lot of seminars for college students. And I'll give an example. We brought a bunch of college students to Israel, I think, in 2024, and everyone was very anxious about they're on college campuses, and so they're going to be really against Israel and what's going to happen and how are we going to deal with that. And what happened was a lot of the kids who came were actually very much in favor of Israel. And the other thing that we're seeing on campus is more people wanting to come through the door in Hillel's, right? More people, and I'm sure you experience this, I would imagine, a lot of communities. More people are interested in being engaged. So if you're asking what do I think about it, I would say, okay, that's part of it, but I want those resources, however much money it took to have that ad, I want that invested in Jewish education. I want that invested in Jewish community. That's what I want us to be focusing on. Yeah.
So we're going to raise hands, and Suzanne and I are each going to take a microphone.
How do you see yourself as a religious leader confronting the occupation in Israel?
I think that I as a religious leader and people in my community need to continuously sound the alarm of what's happening. I think that we have a unique role as religious leaders who can say, you know what, this is not our religion, right? We don't want you to be using Judaism to be burning Palestinian villages, which is happening right now. That's not okay with us. We do not advocate, and I have a lot of students who are putting their They're there. They're out there doing the work every day on the West Bank. So I think that there's putting your body there, and I also think that there's trying to create community that is using Torah in a different way. Again, acknowledging what Mati's saying, that we're having a battle about Torah, right? We're having a battle about how we're going to use Amalek, right? As we get into Purim, are we going to use Amalek as a justification for certain kinds of activities, which it is being used, or are we going to use it in a completely different way, which says, you know what, there is evil around here, there's evil out there. What is that evil? How do I annihilate it, right? We need to be part, I think, as religious people who are interested in peace, we need to be part of those conversations and not pull back. I think that we need to discover what our tradition, and there are, what does our tradition have to say about those, and have that be part of the conversation. It's hard. It's really hard because it's not a dominant force. But I think that's what I see. As a religious leader, I think I see myself as putting our bodies and our Torah on the line. Yeah.
I'm often surprised by how much I don't know, so this is rooted in, among many things that I don't know. I don't want to turn what you said into a theological debate, but I am curious about, part of what I was thinking of listening to you was in thinking about what our tradition says about the exercise of power. It seems like the prophets, that's part of what they're doing, because that was, they're in a time where where the Jewish people had some power and
right.
times when they didn't. And so I had a more coherent way of trying to frame this, but the piece from Hartman is about that, right? I mean,
yeah.
it's what is our tradition? How do we look at our history and our tradition to understand what it means to have some power? So, I mean, I know you can't explain all of the prophets in 5 minutes, but I guess, am I right that there is something there that should speak to us about this kind of question, and how does that help think about this in any way?
Yes, I'm actually so glad that you said that, and it speaks to your comment about how do I see myself, and you can see that I feel a little uncomfortable. But I think doubling down on the prophets has been one of the modes that I've been dealing with this. One of the things. I'm going to say what I'm.
Well, the other thing, there was a discussion earlier about there was a discussion earlier in this talk today about our tradition blaming, I can't remember now what the right way to phrase it is, but that when bad things happen, we look inward, and so
right.
How is that connected to what I'm asking?
Great. Okay. All right. I'll try to. I don't know if it'll be a complete. I will say one of the things I don't know if you know. Well, one of the things that the Hartman Institute is it's also a research institute, and we have scholars who come together and study different texts, and some of it is immediately translated into the podcasts and all the things that you might hear, and some of it is a little bit more what we might call Torah Lishma. In one of that is Torah that we're just learning. So I'm part of a group that studies Bible. It's me, it's if you've heard of Professor Yisrael Knoll, some major professors, Yishai Roseby, some big professors, and we all sit around every Thursday and we learn Tanakh. And last year we learned Isaiah, and this year we're learning Ezekiel. And I will say that personally, partly as a result of this learning and partly as a result of what you're saying, I am more of a Talmud person generally, but I've connected very deeply to certainly elements of the prophets in the broad sense of speaking to the powerful, looking at the powerful and saying, look, you're not seeing the people who are needy, right? And in Ezekiel specifically, I could have given you all, I'm very into Ezekiel right now. Ezekiel's really difficult. I don't know, most people have not read Ezekiel from the beginning, okay? If you read Ezekiel, basically Ezekiel is sitting in Babylonia. It's right before the destruction. He's already been exiled, and there's this like period of 20 years where there's still a community in Israel, and Ezekiel's outside. He's like, guys, it's over. You're totally corrupt. It's gonna end. Just give up. He's looking at what he sees as enormous moral decay, and you feel beaten by Ezekiel. He's like telling you how horrible it is in Jerusalem, and they don't understand, and they're just, and like almost pornographic descriptions of idolatry and all that. And eventually, Ezekiel just says, look, guys, you know what? At this point, you can't appeal to older theologies, right? Older theologies said something like, well, pokeda bon avod al banim. You know what? God actually will continue to exact vengeance on people and the generations that come after. Says Ezekiel, you're using that as an excuse. You're doing all kinds of bad things and saying, oh, the bad things that are happening to us don't have to do with us. They have to do with what the previous generations did. And he says, I'm not buying this anymore. Right now, from now on, ish bechat'o yichyeh, right? Every person is responsible for themselves and for their own sins. So yes, I think this notion of what is the message of the prophets in a specific way? How does complacency happen? How do certain theologies allow moral decay? And how do we dismantle that? I would look at, you should learn Yechezkel Yud Chet. Okay, I'm giving it to you, right? You should learn Yechezkel Yud Chet about how he dismantles these notions of complacency and calls for personal responsibility. Even when the collective, I don't know whether the collective is going to be able to fix things, but each individual better be able to fix things, and that's how we're going to rebuild the collective. So that's one example of the specific use of prophets, and I think that is a really useful voice. Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more questions or comments. Yeah.
So,
who else was waiting? Go ahead.
With David Hartman, the model of Sinai, I'm not learned in trauma, but what I have to say is that trauma, like the trauma in Egypt for the 400 years of slavery there, and then they're going through the desert through generational change. The trauma that's occurring now, is it going to be needing another multi-generational change to be able to start looking at that description of land again as the goal again?
I think I lost you at the last piece.
So
I understand. I think the question about how long is this going to take it's
right,
a real
but
question.
somebody's got to last that long to be able to say, remember when the goal of Israel was X. We're past this trauma. This is what we desire for the state of Israel. We need to rejuvenate that. That's what we were talking about, the description of land when you're drowning.
Right.
Right now, we're drowning.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how many generations, or will it be generational? Is all trauma need multi-generational to get past?
Right.
I don't know.
Right. I think it's a good question, right? And I hope that part of this look at nuance, right, of the degree to which different communities and different individuals are experiencing it, and who's holding the view. Is someone holding the view of the land? Okay, I can't, but maybe you can, right? Are we even having that conversation? I think that that's an important part of it. How long? I don't know. And it is one of my deep worries. I have an 18-year-old. He's going to go into the army. I see what's happening with his friends and the generation of 18 to 25-year-olds who have suffered an enormous amount of loss in terms of their friends and their friends' friends and their siblings, all these, and they've had to go through these like moral, like all kinds of loops to be able to do what is asked for them. They're 18, right? They're 19. They need to, even if they're going to do some questioning later, they're not necessarily, and they shouldn't be doing the level of questioning now. How is this generation going to move? Are they going to be the ones who are going to move forward? I'm not sure. I don't know. I do think that there are some activists I know who are coming right out of their experience of reserves in Gaza and saying, I was there. I want to be the one who's going to tell you how bad this was. So you do have those voices. So how long is it going to take? I'm not sure. I don't know. But I think we need to, be aware of it. Yeah.
So I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you and Yasher Koach for a really illuminating presentation, Devar Torah this morning, and also this. This is, I would say, in many ways, an activist community, people who really care about things and roll up their sleeves and get involved in justice work and other kinds of things. And I also think our particular spin on how we think about tzedek in the world is that we strive to be in, for, and of our community here in West Baltimore and Baltimore City. And so for me, a really important learning today was your approach, which is seek to understand, then maybe judge, and then maybe prescribe. Right. And perhaps we're doing some of those things simultaneously, but I appreciate being able to hear from an Israeli who lives in Israel, to be able to report a little bit about what you're experiencing, what you're seeing, how the literature might speak to this really challenging moment. Sometimes it's hard to understand from the other side of the pond. So I so appreciate what you've brought. Thank you so much to Rabbi Dratch for engaging you and bringing you to visit us at Beth Am. Thanks everybody for joining us, and Shabbat Shalom.